The morning Emily Carter found the envelope, her life was already moving too fast to notice small changes, and that was exactly why the moment mattered so much, because it forced her to stop. She was standing in her Portland kitchen, running late as usual, phone buzzing with reminders, coffee machine humming, rain tapping softly on the window, when she saw it lying on the counter between her keys and a folded grocery receipt. An envelope that did not belong there, cream-colored, clean, without a stamp or return address, placed carefully as if someone had taken time to make sure she would see it, and even though nothing about it looked dangerous, her chest tightened in a way she could not explain, a quiet warning rising from a place she usually kept locked away. Emily was the kind of woman who liked order, who believed life worked best when everything had a label and a plan, and surprises, especially personal ones, made her uneasy, so her first instinct was to ignore it, to assume it was a mistake, maybe something slipped under the wrong door, yet her name was written on it in clear handwriting, not rushed, not printed, but familiar in a way that made her stomach turn, and she told herself she was imagining things, because imagination was safer than memory. She picked it up, felt its weight, light but meaningful, then slid it into the drawer beside the sink, promising herself she would deal with it later, because later was where she stored everything she did not want to face. She left for work, walked through wet streets, greeted neighbors, rode the bus, and smiled politely at strangers, but the envelope followed her in her thoughts, pulling at her focus during meetings, whispering during quiet moments at the library where she worked, a place full of stories she loved helping others discover while carefully avoiding the unfinished story of her own. Emily had always believed that if something truly mattered, it would demand attention loudly, but this thing did not shout, it waited, and that waiting made it powerful. By noon she caught herself checking her phone for messages that were not there, her hands restless, her heart uneasy, and when a coworker asked if she was okay, she nodded too quickly, because explaining would make it real. Her past was something she had packed away with care, not because it was painful in obvious ways, but because it was unresolved. And unresolved things had sharp edges. When her shift finally ended and she returned home, the apartment felt quieter than usual, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, and she knew there was no avoiding it anymore, because the envelope had already changed the rhythm of her day. She stood at the counter, opened the drawer, and took it out, noticing how her hands shook despite her effort to stay calm, and she thought of how many years it had been since she last felt this kind of nervous energy, the kind that came with hope mixed with fear. She tore it open slowly, half expecting nothing, half expecting everything, and inside found a single page, folded once, with no greeting, no name, just one line written with care: "You deserve to know the truth about what you lost." And the moment she read it, the air seemed to leave the room, because those words did not speak to a general loss, they spoke to a specific one, a name she had not said aloud in years but which appeared in her mind instantly, clear and unavoidable: Daniel Brooks. Daniel had been more than a chapter, he had been a turning point, a man she met when her life was still open and uncertain, when dreams felt close enough to touch, and loving him had felt natural, easy, and frightening all at once, because it asked her to imagine a future that required courage. She remembered his calm voice, the way he listened without interrupting, the way silence with him never felt empty, and she also remembered the day they decided to let go, not with anger or blame, but with careful words and brave faces, pretending that timing was a small thing when it was actually everything, she had told herself. She moved on, built routines, dated casually, focused on work, and learned to live without expecting too much, but the truth was that she never stopped wondering, and the letter had touched that quiet wondering like a spark. She sat down, heart racing, reread the sentence again and again, searching for meaning, for intent, for explanation, but there was nothing else, no address, no clue, just the suggestion that something important had been left unsaid, and she felt a strange mix of anger and curiosity, because whoever wrote this knew her well enough to know it would not let her sleep. That night she lay awake staring at the ceiling, memories rising without permission, moments she had convinced herself no longer mattered, and she wondered why now, why after all this time, and whether opening that envelope had already set something in motion she could not stop. She told herself she would forget it by morning, that life would pull her forward again, but deep down she knew that secrets, once revealed, did not quietly disappear. They waited until you were ready or until they decided to change you. and as the rain continued outside and the city slept, Emily felt, for the first time in years, that her carefully built sense of control was slipping, not in a way that felt dangerous, but in a way that felt honest, and somewhere in that honesty was the beginning of a choice she had not yet realized she would have to make. Emily did not expect the letter to pull her backward so quickly. But the next days proved how fragile distance from the past could be, because once a door opens in the mind, memories rush through without asking permission, and Daniel Brooks returned to her thoughts with sharp clarity. She tried to keep her routine, waking early, going to work, answering emails, smiling at readers, but everything felt thinner, like a stage set that could fall apart with one touch, and every quiet moment carried his presence, not as pain but as unfinished meaning. She remembered meeting him in Seattle on a cold evening at a small public lecture, both arriving alone, both leaving together, talking as if they had known each other longer than a few hours, and from that first night, something steady formed between them, not loud or dramatic, but deep, the kind of connection that grows through shared silences and trust. Daniel never rushed her, never asked her to be someone else, and that safety was what scared her most, because it asked her to believe in something lasting. Their days had been simple, filled with walks, late dinners, quiet plans, and for a long time, Emily thought that was what love was supposed to feel like, calm and certain, until real choices arrived. When Daniel received the offer to move to Toronto, he did not hide it or soften it. He told her honestly, explained the opportunity, the future it promised, and waited for her response, and Emily, standing at the edge of her own dreams, felt trapped between love and fear of losing herself. She told herself distance would break them anyway, that asking someone to stay was selfish, that strong people let go when paths divide, and Daniel, seeing her hesitation, chose not to push, not to demand, believing respect meant stepping back. They ended things gently, no shouting, no blame, just quiet sadness and careful words, promising to stay in touch, promising things they did not know how to keep. For weeks afterward, Emily waited for the pain she expected, but instead felt a strange calm, convincing herself she had made the mature choice, the right one, and when Daniel's messages slowly became fewer, she told herself that was proof she had done the sensible thing. Time passed, work filled her days, life moved forward, and she packed the relationship away like an old book she loved too much to reread. But now, with the letter in her mind, she began to question the story she had told herself, because the words "the truth about what you lost" suggested there was more, something she had never been allowed to see. Late at night, she searched old emails, reread conversations, noticed pauses she once ignored, kindness she had mistaken for acceptance, and for the first time, she allowed herself to wonder if Daniel had wanted more than she realized. Regret did not come as loud sorrow, but as quiet questions, asking what might have happened if she had been braver, if she had spoken honestly instead of protecting herself. The second envelope arrived 3 days later, taped to her door, and the moment she saw it, her heart sank and lifted at the same time. Because now there was no doubt the letter was meant for her, meant to continue, meant to be followed. Inside was an address written in the same careful hand, and just one word beneath it, Toronto. Emily stood frozen in the hallway, feeling the weight of choice pressing on her chest, because the past was no longer a memory, it was asking for her presence. She spent the night pacing, telling herself it was foolish, reminding herself that years had passed, that people change, that reopening old doors rarely ends well. Yet another part of her, quieter but stronger, knew this was not about going back, it was about understanding. She thought of how safe her life had been, how controlled, how lonely in ways she rarely admitted, and she realized that avoiding pain had also meant avoiding risk, and risk was where real life lived. By morning, her decision was not dramatic, just clear, and as she booked the flight, she did not imagine grand outcomes or perfect endings. She simply accepted that some stories demand to be finished, not to be rewritten, but to be understood. And as the confirmation email appeared on her screen, Emily felt fear, hope, and calm settle together in her chest, because whatever waited for her in Toronto, it would finally be the truth she had lived without for far too long. Toronto greeted Emily with cold air and sharp light, the kind that made everything feel clear and exposed. And as she stepped out of the airport, pulling her coat tighter, she felt like someone walking into a life she had paused rather than left behind. She did not allow herself to imagine what she would say or how Daniel would look, because expectations felt dangerous, so she focused on movement, on trains and streets and the address written carefully on the paper she checked again and again as if it might change. The cafe stood near the waterfront, modest and warm, its windows glowing softly against the gray sky, and for a long moment Emily stayed outside, watching people come and go, reminding herself that she could still turn back, that no one had forced her to come this far, yet something steadier than fear kept her rooted until she finally pushed the door open. The smell of coffee and quiet conversation filled the space, and then she saw him, seated near the window, shoulders relaxed, hands folded around a cup, older than she remembered but familiar in a way that made her chest tighten, and when Daniel looked up and met her eyes, surprise crossed his face, followed by relief so clear it left no room for doubt. They stood awkwardly at first, unsure whether to hug or speak, until words found them, simple greetings that carried years of distance, and when they finally sat across from each other, the silence between them felt full rather than empty. Daniel spoke first, not rushing, telling her he never expected her to come, admitting he almost hoped she would not, because hope made things harder, and Emily listened, noticing how his voice still had the calm tone that once made her feel safe. He explained the letter without drama, saying he had written it years ago during a restless night, a letter he planned to send before leaving Seattle, because he had intended to ask her to build a future with him, one that included marriage and shared plans. But when he sensed her fear, her hesitation, he convinced himself that love meant letting go instead of asking her to choose, and so the letter stayed in a drawer, forgotten until recently, when a move and an old box brought it back into his hands. Emily felt the truth settle heavily but clearly. Not as accusation, but as understanding, because she saw now how both of them had protected each other by staying silent, and how silence had cost them more than honesty ever could. Daniel admitted he had built a life in Toronto, steady and responsible, but never complete in the way he once imagined, and Emily shared how she had filled her days with work and structure, avoiding deep attachments, believing she had made peace with the past when she had only buried it. Their conversation moved quickly yet carefully, touching years of distance without getting lost in regret, because neither wanted to rewrite history, only to understand it. When they walked outside together, the lake stretched wide and calm, and Daniel asked her a simple question, not about the past, but about now, asking if she believed people could choose differently when they finally told the truth, and Emily did not answer right away, because honesty required time. She felt the pull of what they had been and the weight of who they were now, understanding that love did not erase responsibility or time, but it could change how those things were carried. They parted without promises, just a quiet agreement to think, to respect what had grown between them and what had grown separately. And as Emily returned to her hotel, the city lights reflecting on the water, she felt lighter and heavier at once, because the truth she came for was not simple, but it was real, and for the first time in years, she knew that whatever choice she made next would be hers, guided not by fear of loss, but by clarity, and that realization alone had already changed her. Emily returned to Portland with a quiet strength she had never carried before, not because everything was solved, but because nothing was hidden anymore, and that honesty changed how the world felt around her. The familiar streets, the library shelves, the steady rhythm of her days all looked the same, yet she moved through them differently, aware of how carefully she had once lived, how often she chose comfort over truth, and the meeting in Toronto stayed with her not as a romantic fantasy but as a clear mirror showing her who she had been and who she could still become. She did not rush into decisions, did not call Daniel immediately, did not tell friends dramatic stories. Instead she listened to herself, noticing how silence no longer felt safe but heavy, how routines without meaning felt empty, and how fear had shaped more of her life than she was willing to accept. Weeks passed, and Emily found herself thinking less about what might go wrong and more about what she wanted, something she had rarely asked herself directly, and the answer surprised her with its simplicity, because she did not want certainty, she wanted honesty, movement, and shared effort. One evening, after closing the library, she sat alone at her desk and wrote a letter, not dramatic or emotional, just clear, telling Daniel she did not know what the future looked like but knew she no longer wanted to live quietly out of fear, and she thanked him for telling the truth even when it arrived late, because late truth was still better than silence. Sending that letter felt less like a risk and more like alignment, as if her actions were finally matching her heart. Changes followed slowly but steadily, conversations with her manager, careful planning, difficult goodbyes to coworkers who had become family, and through it all, Emily felt calm, not reckless, because this choice was not about chasing love, it was about choosing herself fully. When she arrived in Toronto months later, not as a visitor but as someone starting again, Daniel met her without expectations, without pressure, and they agreed to move forward with patience, allowing trust to grow in the present rather than living in the shadow of what might have been. Their days were ordinary in the best way, shared meals, honest talks, quiet walks by the lake, and moments where they learned who the other had become, not clinging to the past but respecting it. Emily noticed how love felt different now, not urgent or idealized, but grounded, built on choice rather than chance, and she realized that the secret she once tried to ignore had never been about Daniel alone, it had been about her fear of wanting something deeply and risking disappointment. Standing one evening by the water, watching the city lights reflect across the lake, Emily understood that life did not change in loud, dramatic moments, but through small brave decisions made consistently, and as she leaned into the calm beside her, she felt grateful not just for love rediscovered, but for the courage to face truth when it finally arrived, knowing that ignoring it would have kept her safe, but listening to it had finally allowed her to live.